Mark 8, 1 to 30. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance." His disciples answered, "But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them?" "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present. After he had sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for 1 loaf they had with them in the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." They discussed this with one another and said, "It is because we have no bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him.
So with today's passage that we just had read out, we have now entered into what is the halfway point of the Gospel of Mark. That with 16 chapters all up, this obviously makes chapters 8 and 9 as the middle of the book. And as we now enter this central section of it, we now see that a lot of things are going to change very quickly, as some of the most significant parts of any of the Gospels are now going to be brought up. Because both the passages for this week and next Sunday as well are going to record 2 major events that has Jesus teaching and revealing many things, and that what is said, it is going to explain clearly just what Jesus' ministry is all about. And also on top of that, how it is that we're to respond to him, what that ministry, what he's doing, what this should all mean to us. And then on top of those points there, the big theology coming out and the theme and what it means to us, after these revelations are given, just for the narrative of the gospel, just for Mark, this will then change everything from this point on in Jesus' ministry, as the focus is going forward from here. It's now going to be very different all the way to the end of the book. Because whereas Jesus has just so far, as we've read through these first 7 or so chapters, he's gone from town to town, and he's gone through many different regions that were once what you'd call the old kingdom of Israel. This is the part of the world, the geography that he's been traveling around. Well, after this middle section, he's now going to head to Jerusalem. And when he gets there, this is where his mission's going to end, as he dies and rises again and then fulfills his purpose to save his people. But this halfway point, it marks a significant shift in what is the narrative of the Gospels, as having told many that the kingdom has come, be prepared for it, as well as giving what is glimpses of it by all his various miracles and things that he's done. Well, Jesus is now going to head from this point forward towards what is his ultimate goal of dying for sin and conquering death itself, which is what makes what happens here and what marks this turning point in this passage today critical for knowing what that gospel message is, what it is that we're to believe in, because here in chapter 8, we're going to get the answer to the question that many have contemplated. They've all been wondering this all through Jesus' ministry, and that is, who exactly is Jesus? Who is this man that does these miracles and he teaches these new and what is challenging ideas? Because this is the question that has been raised over and over again since the very start of Mark's gospel. That as these miracles have been done, and Jesus heals the sick and he expels demons and he speaks with such wisdom and knowledge beyond what any normal person could ever possibly possess. Well, we've seen it say that people have been amazed by all these things and they've been left in awe at all that he does. And this is why they keep asking each other. They keep saying, who is this that can do such things? That we've seen that even the disciples themselves have asked, who is this man? As the miracles such as calm in the storm, it simply went beyond what anyone could ever imagine someone being able to do. And as Jesus has left everyone bewildered by what he has done, we have seen so many different answers to this question. Because some have said that Jesus was a prophet returned, like Elijah. And we've seen some think, such as Herod, that he was John the Baptist after he had John killed. So many have been led to conclude that Jesus must be the reincarnation of a dead prophet. And that's because he's got the power and knowledge of God, and to an extent that they've never seen before. He's got to be getting it from somewhere. And whilst they don't know exactly who Jesus is, they believe that he must be from God, because there can simply be no explanation for all that he's doing. But whilst these have been the guesses that have come from a place of what is really awe and respect, right? They're positive. And whilst they don't know he is the Son of God, they know that God must be working through him. That's the conclusion they've come to. Well, what we've also seen is there have been other guesses that have actually been more accusative, as they've seen Jesus as a threat and not actually as a man from God. Because we've also seen that the Pharisees have said that Jesus was able to do these things by Beelzebub, which means for them the question of who is this man was that Jesus was of Satan, or maybe even Satan himself. Because as Jesus has done these miracles, everyone has simply been left confused, bewildered as to who exactly he is, as no one has the answer, and yet they know that there is something very different about him. That no one yet, through the opening part of Mark, has been able to figure it out, but they can all tell that he's no normal man, and there has to be a reason, either good or bad, for why he knows what he knows and can do what he can do. But whilst that has been the story so far, people left wondering who Jesus is, and everyone simply trying to make their best guess, just trying to figure it out. Well, here, when we get to this part in the center of Mark, we actually do get the answer to the question that everyone has. That has taken half of the book to get to this point, but here the answer finally gets given, hence why this passage will mark a turning point going forward. Because as we'll see today and next week, Jesus is now going to be fully revealed. And now there's going to be no excuse for those who know him best, the disciples. And there's going to be now no need for us to keep trying to guess and answer to this question. Because Jesus will now admit to them and reveal to them who he is. And now after this moment, as we read this today, we also have that answer as well. That when someone asks today, they ask the question, who is Jesus? What does he matter? Why should I trust in him? But when people ask a question like that, even now today, here we see just what makes Jesus so special and why we must all now trust in him, because he is the long-promised saviour of all those who trust and depend on God. That as the world is in sin and that we today are therefore all in sin and living in rejection of God, well, here we get told that Jesus is the long-awaited one who came to fix this divide and then to bring us back to our Father in heaven. Because here it is where he now admits to his disciples that he is the anointed one, the chosen one, who is the Son of God, and that he came here to take away our sin and bring us into his kingdom. And he's bringing us into the kingdom that he spent all his time so far telling everyone about. That all through Mark, he's taught and shown glimpses of this kingdom of God. But now here, he's going to make it known that he is the one, and he's the only one that can actually take any of us into this kingdom that he's been talking about. So looking at the first part of this passage now, we're going to first look at what Jesus does here, and then also look at how it is that people respond to him before then getting into what is the big revelation that this larger passage that we've had read out today is building up to. And what we see here at the start of chapter 8 is that Jesus first does a miracle, which is really exactly the same to the one that was seen just a few chapters before this. Because for those of us in our Connect group on Tuesdays, we saw in the second half of chapter 6 that Jesus fed there 5,000 men who had come to listen to him. And we looked at how this was both an incredible miracle as well as being what is a special passage in Mark, as it's one of the very few events that we actually see recorded in all four Gospels. That each of the Gospels have what is a special focus, and they don't all record the exact same things. So you might find certain events in one Gospel or two or even three of them, but very rarely in all four of them. And that there's actually only a handful of common passages that each of the Gospels talk about. So if you think back to when we started this series on Christmas Day, it was mentioned how Jesus' birth and his childhood, which is obviously a very significant thing in the life of Jesus, they're actually only mentioned in two of them. And that this Gospel, Mark, only has Jesus first being mentioned when he was baptized by John. That there's actually no mention of him being born, as we see in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. So other than the events of John baptizing him at the very start, as well as what is his entry into Jerusalem and then his betrayal and his death and resurrection at the end, well, other than those events, the feeding of the 5,000 is the only other one that all four wanted to mention. Not even his birth was mentioned in all four. So it's a special miracle in that sense, as we have it recorded in all of them. But whilst the feeding of the 5,000 is noticeable for that, we do see, however, what is a near identical miracle being recorded here. Because again, thousands of people have come to listen to Jesus. And we see that out of concern for their strength, as they haven't eaten for 3 days, he tells the disciples that these people need to be fed. But this event here and what's about to happen, whilst being the same type of miracle, feeding all these people, this one now reveals something significant about the disciples, as it shows what is their continuous inability to really understand just who Jesus is. Because after Jesus says to them, these people need food, we read them say here, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? So even though they have seen this exact same situation before of thousands of people needing food and Jesus miraculously feeding them all, Well, again, they seem unable to realize that this issue was simply no problem for Jesus, that he can feed them just as he did before with the other group. So we can see by this that there is this ongoing cloud and just this darkness, spiritual darkness, blinding them to who Jesus is and what he can do. That no matter what he's done before, it still just keeps leading them to them asking, who is this man? And then again, never actually coming to the right answer. That the issue with the disciples is that they constantly keep forgetting just what Jesus has done before. So it has them always going back to seeing him as being limited and not actually seeing him for who he truly is, seeing him as the Son of God. But whilst they show their doubt here and wonder how they'll get these people fed, we see that in the end, just like with the 5,000, Jesus takes some bread and fish, multiplies them, and he feeds them all. And then again, like chapter 9, it says here in verse 8, afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over, showing that Jesus didn't simply share out a small amount of food and spread it out amongst this massive crowd, but he actually created food in abundance. That the people ended up with much more than what they started with, showing his power over all things and even the ability to what is essentially just create things out of nothing. He made more food than what they started with. So there is both another incredible miracle by Jesus here, showing just who he is, but also a clear demonstration of what is this ongoing blindness that even the disciples had to just who Jesus is. That at this point, it seems as if no matter what Jesus does, they simply just can't figure him out. That the question is always just going to be, who is this man? Almost like it's the first time they've ever seen anything like this. But having now looked at the first miracle in our passage for today, which is a pretty significant one, as Jesus has yet again turned a small amount of food into a large enough quantity to feed thousands and still have plenty of food left over. Well, if we now jump down the passage, down to verse 22, we see another one of his healing ministries in this chapter, this time with someone who is literally blind. Not just spiritually blind, but they are physically blind. And this one is a little bit unique as well, because we see that some people bring this man to Jesus, and then Jesus doesn't heal him there, right in front of these people, but he leads them out of the village so they're alone. And then once they are out there, we then have this unusual 2-stage healing going on, as Jesus heals him once by touching the man's eyes, but it doesn't quite work right. He still can't fully see, so he does it again, and only then are the man's eyes healed. And we don't get an explanation for this 2 stages of healing. The passage simply doesn't explain if it was a lack of faith on the man's behalf, so Jesus only did half the job to get the man realizing just who it is that was in front of him, and then after that, finish the job now that the man knew that Jesus was legit. We don't get any of that information. We can only speculate as to what's going on here. But the truth is that we don't know, as it simply doesn't say. It's just given us the fact that this is how it happened. And that's all we really need to know about that. There was this 2 stages of healing going on for whatever reason. But despite this limited information, we do see something important in what Jesus says to him after he heals him. Because we read it say in verse 26, Jesus sent him home saying, don't even go into the village. So what this means is, again, at this point, Jesus is still keeping his identity secret and trying to keep a low profile and does not want people to know of him yet. That, like how he's told others, don't tell anyone what just happened. And he's even told the demons to stop calling him the Son of God and revealing this fact to people. But we see here, Jesus clearly still is not wanting at this stage to be told, for people to be told specifically who he is, or to bring unwanted attention to himself. Doesn't want all the crowds running to him just to be healed. That he might want the disciples to figure it out, as we'll see in a moment, but he doesn't want everyone to know just yet. until he's finished his purpose, until he's accomplished what he has come to do. Then it will all be revealed, as we've seen in the book of Acts and at the end of the Gospels, but for now, not yet. So just to recap what we've seen so far in this chapter, it's the fact that Jesus is still doing some amazing things, like he's done from the beginning right up to this point. And whilst he tells people to keep quiet, he's not going to be against the disciples knowing who he is. Because as we'll see, he wants them to know. And in fact, he's actually going to be disappointed that just like the blind man here in the middle of the healing that was done for him, that just like him, the disciples also can only seemingly half see. That they've seen enough to know Jesus is special, so their eyes are open somewhat. They're not totally blind, yet it's not quite enough for them to figure it all out. They're still asking at this point, who is this man? When really by now, the answer to that question should be obvious. They've seen enough to figure it out, but they're still half blind. They're just not seeing it all. Now, as you would have noticed, we did skip an important part of this passage, as we did not look at verses 11 to 21 before. So now we're going to go back up the chapter. As having seen the miracles that were done here, we now will start seeing the responses to them. And there are two groups that we've got to look at here. And they are the Pharisees and the disciples. And we're going to see that both groups are going to frustrate Jesus here, as they're both going to show a lack of understanding and a lack of faith. That the big issue of this passage is the lack of faith that people have. And this lack of faith, it blinds them to the truth. And in this situation, it's actually going to be true for both groups, both the Pharisees and also the disciples. Because it says here in verse 11, the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. So as we know, this has been the recurring theme over the last several chapters, that they do not believe him to be of God, and they continue to try and catch him out. And that even after feeding the thousands just before this and doing such a thing for the second time, as well as all these other miracles, we see that they still do not believe him to be genuine. So they're now asking for what is yet again another sign. And that's because they want God to basically verify who he is by doing something that is so extraordinary that it proves Jesus' authority. That they're not going to be satisfied until God himself has made it known to them that Jesus really is from him. That's what it means as a sign from heaven. Something beyond and above Jesus that will actually prove he really is from God. And what we see is that Jesus simply refuses this demand. He just ignores them, and he won't be pressured into this. Because the simple fact is that they've all been shown what they need to know in order to figure out who he is, yet they just refuse to believe. They're just not going to accept it. Which is why at this point, considering how many opportunities they've had, well, from this point on, no sign is going to make a difference. And it's not going to make a difference because their fundamental lack of faith just stops them from seeing it. It's not going to change them. Because we've already seen, if we go all the way back to chapter 3, that they already saw something miraculous. They already had a sign, but they just said it was by demonic rule that he did these miracles. And then even further back in chapter 1, when Jesus was baptized, it says that the Spirit came on him and that the Father said from heaven, "This is my Son." So this means any sign will likewise, from now on, it's either going to be ignored, they'll just dismiss it, they won't even see it, they won't understand it, or they'll simply claim, again, that it's actually of Satan and not God that these supernatural things are happening. And as we know from later on, if we cheat, if we skip ahead and go to the end of Mark, well, we know from Mark and from the book of Acts, the rest of the New Testament, that even when he came back from the dead, well, these same people still refused to believe. Even that was not enough for them. As Jesus even said in his parable about the rich man and Lazarus, even if someone comes back from the dead, they won't believe, which means this is why he doesn't give in to their demands. No sign is going to change their fundamental lack of faith. So what we can see here is by this demand for a sign that there is still the question from them, who is Jesus? But the problem is the answer, it's not something they really want. Because for those who don't want the truth, any sign, it's going to be insufficient. And they've actually already had their chances to see who he is. They just need to open their eyes, but they don't want to. They don't want the real answer. But whilst this is the blindness and the lack of faith of the Pharisees, well, this now leads us to the issue of the disciples. How are they responding to all this? And what we see is that sadly, it's not just the Pharisees who have their eyes closed, because even Jesus' closest followers are still not getting it. That they, like the blind man, may have had their eyes half opened and they're no longer totally blind, but we also see that they have not got their full sight yet. Because like the Pharisees, they also can't answer this question either. That's the problem. They still can't say who Jesus is, as they themselves haven't figured it out despite having seen all the signs, having had all the opportunities. And we see that due to this lack of faith by everyone so far, that Jesus warns them about the dangers of this. Because we see that he now links these two things together, the miracles that they've seen, as well as the Pharisees' rejection of him due to their lack of faith. Because we see Jesus say here, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. And we see that the disciples, when hearing this, they immediately start talking about a lack of bread and how they have inadequate supplies. That their mind immediately goes to what is worldly issues, and they simply miss what Jesus is warning them about. Because where Jesus is talking about the Pharisees' lack of faith and their corrupting hypocrisy and how they're blind to all that he says and does and the negative influence that this has on all people, the disciples not only miss the warning that is given, but almost show themselves to be not much better. But they too are just not hearing Jesus' words. And this is why they now start to worry about having what is a lack of bread, despite having seen twice now Jesus being able to feed thousands of people. That bread is clearly not an issue. Their supplies is not something that Jesus would be warning them about. And with such confusion and just not understanding what Jesus is saying, this is why we see so much disappointment from him towards them here. Because we see him say to them in verse 17, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And then after reminding them about how much food was left over from feeding both the 5,000 and then just before this, feeding the 4,000, he says in verse 21, do you still not understand? So even here, we see that disciples only have their eyes half open. That they too, they struggle to understand who Jesus is, even after seeing and hearing all these things, which means just like everyone else, they also can't answer the question, who is Jesus? Because if they knew the answer, if they knew he was the Son of God, and if they had realized that at this point, then this kind of ignorance would be gone. They wouldn't be worried about not having enough supplies, nor forgetting what Jesus just said and done only moments earlier. But because at this stage, they still lack what is a spiritual mind, that they're still caught in the thoughts of this world. There is a spiritual blindness over them that's keeping them in this state of lacking true faith and keeping them blind to who Jesus is. This is why they can't answer the question of why Jesus is so disappointed. That on this particular point, they're not much better than the Pharisees, as no matter what Jesus says or does, none of it is clicking for them. But now, as we read on, we see that this issue, this problem that has persisted right through the entire Gospel of Mark, this is now going to change and the blindness will be removed. That why this passage in the middle of the book is so significant is because this is where it does all click. That at least for one of them, they will answer the question as to who Jesus is, and as Jesus confirms that this is true, that has been answered correctly, we also now got the answer as to who he really is. That this passage is to be a revelation for us as well, as it tells us plainly now who Jesus is and how we today are to see him as well. Because we now see in verse 27 that he asks them the very question that is on everyone's mind. He says, "Who do people say I am?" And we see that the disciples reply as they give the various opinions about who Jesus is, because we read them answer here. Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. So this shows that nothing has changed in the thinking of most people since the early stages of his ministry, as it's really the same answers, the same things being said that we saw right from the start. That even at this point, people are still miles away from the truth in their guesses, and they still haven't figured it out. They just think he's some prophet who has returned from the dead. But then we get the most important part, and one of the most important well-known quotes in the entire Bible, because we see Jesus ask, "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" And then we get Peter saying, "You are the Messiah." So this is the moment that at least one of them gets it. Peter has stated now that Jesus is in fact the one that they've all been waiting for. And more importantly, we see here that Jesus doesn't disagree. That he makes no attempt to deny what Peter has said, and even says, as he often does, "Don't tell anyone." So he is at this point confessing to this. So far, Jesus has avoided the question, but now he admits that he is the one. He is, in fact, the Messiah. It is true. Which means that this message he's been spreading about God's kingdom, that's been the big thing that he's been doing. Well, this is the moment he makes it known that he's not just the messenger of this good news, but he's the one to actually bring this good news about. He's the one who will bring people into this kingdom. That Jesus himself is who will bring God's kingdom into this world as being the Messiah. This means that he is God's anointed one. Because that word Messiah, we hear it a lot, but it's just a word for that, anointed one. Just like the word Christ is just the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. They mean the same thing. So at this time, everyone's been waiting for God's anointed one, the Messiah, the Christ, to come. And now someone has said to Jesus, "You are this anointed one." And Jesus isn't denying it. He's not telling Peter that he's got it wrong. And that, of course, is very significant. It's significant not just for the order of events that is recorded in Mark, because things will change from this moment on, but of course it's significant for us reading it today. Because this lack of denial, and not only does it show who Jesus is, but it also means that we cannot have the limited view of who he is, as many of the people in the gospel did, as Jesus either is the Messiah or he's not, and if not, then everything else he did would mean nothing and be a lie. Because if he wasn't really the Messiah, and yet here he doesn't deny it, he claims it to be true, he would simply be a liar, or even worse, a crazy person. So this means he wouldn't be a wise teacher or a good person who's worth listening to, as by agreeing to this statement, Peter says he's the Messiah, and he doesn't disagree. He says, "Just don't tell anyone." By agreeing to that statement, "You're the Messiah," means that he now actually has to live up to it, that this is who he actually is. So this is clearly not a situation where everyone keeps pointing to Jesus, that he's some special person, and it's just that no one will believe him when he says that he's not. He's denying, "Oh, no, I'm not the Messiah. Stop saying that's who I am." He's not denying it, because we see here Jesus, he knows who he is. He knows he's the Christ, and he's not pretending to be otherwise. He's not saying that they have the wrong person or they should go looking for someone else, that the Messiah is yet to come. It's not like John the Baptist. He's not saying, I'm not the Messiah. Wait, someone more important's coming. Because here's the big moment, the thing that Mark's all been building up to. Peter has now said that Jesus is the one that they've been waiting for, the one that the Jews have been waiting centuries for, and Jesus is just happy that someone now gets it. This is what he's wanted, for it to finally click for at least one of them. So the big thing here is that it may have taken half the book to get to this point. And Jesus has traveled from one side of Israel to the other in this time, doing all kinds of incredible things. But someone finally recognizes that through all these signs, he's the Messiah, as he is the one who has come to save his people and who they are to have their faith in. That big point is now known. And whilst this was the defining moment in the Gospels, as it finally answered the question that people had of Jesus back then, well, this also becomes the main point for us today, as this is still the question that all people have even now. Because the question of who is Jesus is not something that has ever gone away. That even now, today, everyone has at some point, or will at some point have to think about this. And it's why we still see that people continue to debate just who Jesus was, as they're still trying to come up with an answer. Because you ask many atheists, people who don't believe in God, or even agnostics, people who are just, God might be there, I don't know, I can't say one way or the other. You ask any of these people who Jesus is. Just ask someone in the street, who do you think Jesus is? And they will in fact have an answer. It's something that most people have thought about, even if they haven't realized it, even if they don't believe in him, as everyone has some answer in regard to this question. Because ask people who Jesus is, and they'll say something like, the story of Jesus is just a fairy tale. That he's just a mythical figure that probably didn't exist, but even if he did, he would have been nothing like how we speak of him today, right? Nothing like how Mark's gospel presents him. That's the kind of answer that you might get. Others, however, will say that he was a real person, but might say that he was some sort of con man who told lies and crazy ideas, and that the world is still caught up in this deception even to this day. That people today, they would say of us in this room right now, we're still falling for the lie, and the lie that he was the Son of God, yet nothing he said was true, right? It's just myth. And people have bought into the story that has been created. And of course, there will be those, whilst not believing in Jesus, that's not where their faith is, they would at least say something positive. They'd say he was a nice man, a man who preached and taught good things and was doing good things to others. That he's a wise teacher, even if the things that he said got him killed. That he had some good ideas that people just weren't ready for. He's worth listening to, but you wouldn't believe in him to raise you from the dead. Wouldn't go that far. And of course, to this day, we see that many religions, even now, still have their opinion on Jesus. Muslims believe that Jesus is real, but to them, he's just a prophet, right? He's not the Son of God. He's not the Messiah. They've got the same kind of idea that we see in Mark. He's just a prophet, nothing more. And we see that Jews still see him as a false Messiah whose claims were all wrong. That they don't deny that he lived. They believe he was really there, but he was no Messiah. They're still waiting for that Messiah to come. So what this means is the question of who is this man that was so common back then that we see all through the Gospel of Mark, it is actually still being asked today. That question hasn't gone away. Even now, just like back then, almost all people have heard of Jesus. And they've all tried at some level. They might not have given it much thought, but at some level, they have tried to answer that question. So whether people like to admit it or not, almost everyone does have an opinion on who Jesus was, and they're all going to have some kind of answer in their mind when that question is asked. But whatever answer they come up with, the big thing for us is that the real answer is actually being given. Because it's here, it's in this particular passage, we get told who Jesus really is, and that answer, it needs a response. Because we either believe it and we see Jesus as our Savior, as God's anointed, the King of God's kingdom, the one to bring it in, or we don't. That we either believe he is the Messiah, the Christ, or he isn't. We've got to come to some conclusion. But whatever we might come up with, whether it's the kind of ideas we hear around the world or the one that you might personally believe, the fact is an answer has been given. And we've got to believe it or not. So if we read the Bible, if we read Mark's gospel and believe what we read here, if we take all the things that Jesus says about loving our neighbor and about the promises of forgiveness, the promise of life in heaven, ever after this one, and take it all as being true, then we can't at the same time just ignore this claim and answer the question, who is Jesus, with our own ideas. That's what people in the world do. They want to believe in heaven. They want to believe in loving your neighbor, but they don't want to go all the way. And yet none of that other stuff means anything if we don't take what Jesus himself has revealed about himself. Because if Jesus is Messiah, then we actually need to see him as such. And if we see him as that, we then have to respond to that appropriately. And that means doing what so many back then couldn't do, and what so many even today also fail to do, which is simply having our faith in him. To not be asking for a sign like the Pharisees. To be saying today, oh, God, I'll believe if only you answer this prayer, if only you show me something for me to believe. Or not to be having eyes but failing to see and ears but failing to hear like the disciples were. Like people today read it and still just don't put their faith in Jesus. We can't be like either of them because we now have the answer. The answer is that Jesus is the Christ, he's our Savior, and all we have to do is believe in him. Now, like the blind man, we don't have to do anything ourselves to be healed. We simply have to trust in Jesus. And that means not trying to answer the question of who Jesus is with our own opinions, but it means just instead simply believing who it is that Jesus himself has revealed himself to be.